In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He had defeated kingdoms, humbled empires, and built one of the greatest military forces Europe had ever seen. Across the continent, his victories seemed unstoppable. To many, it appeared that Napoleon could not lose. Yet within a few months, the most powerful army in Europe would be shattered. Not by a revolutionary weapon, not by a brilliant enemy general, and not by a single decisive battle. Instead, Napoleon would face an opponent that could not be negotiated with, intimidated, or defeated. An opponent that would slowly destroy his army one day at a time. This is the story of the secret weapon that crushed Napoleon. By 1812, Napoleon controlled much of Europe. His empire stretched across the continent, and nations that once opposed him had either been defeated or forced into uneasy alliances. At the center of his power stood the Grande Armée, a military force unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched under Napoleon's command. They were experienced, disciplined, and supported by vast numbers of cavalry, artillery, and supply wagons. For years, this army had brought victory after victory. Napoleon believed that one final campaign would secure his dominance over Europe. His target was Russia. Relations between France and Russia had deteriorated. The Russian Empire was refusing to fully cooperate with Napoleon's economic policies, and tensions between the two powers continued to rise. Napoleon decided that the solution was simple: invade Russia. If he could defeat the Russian army quickly, he believed the Russian government would be forced to negotiate. It was a strategy that had worked before, but Russia was not like the countries Napoleon had conquered in the past. In June of 1812, the invasion began. The Grande Armée crossed into Russian territory. The scale of the operation was staggering. Columns of infantry stretched for miles. Thousands of horses pulled artillery and supplies. Military bands played as soldiers marched confidently eastward. Many believed they were beginning another campaign that would end in victory. At first, everything appeared to go according to plan. The Russian army retreated. Again and again, Napoleon advanced deeper into Russian territory, expecting a decisive battle that would destroy his opponent. But the Russians refused to cooperate. Instead of standing and fighting, they withdrew. Villages were abandoned, food supplies disappeared, fields were destroyed. Every mile Napoleon advanced took him farther from his supply lines and deeper into unfamiliar territory. Still, he continued forward, because every previous success had taught him the same lesson: advance boldly, strike hard, win quickly. What he did not yet realize was that the Russians were fighting a very different kind of war. As the summer progressed, Napoleon pushed deeper into Russia. His army captured towns, crossed rivers, and occupied territory at an astonishing pace. On maps, the campaign looked like a success, but appearances were deceiving. Every step forward created new problems. The farther the Grande Armée advanced, the longer its supply lines became. Wagons struggled across rough roads. Horses became exhausted. Food and equipment took longer to arrive. Meanwhile, the Russians continued to retreat. To many French officers, it was frustrating. They wanted a decisive battle. They wanted to destroy the Russian army and end the war. Instead, they found empty villages and burned fields. The Russians were deliberately denying Napoleon the resources he needed. This strategy would later become known as scorched earth. Anything useful to the invading army was destroyed before the French could reach it. Food, shelter, livestock, supplies, everything vanished. French soldiers entered village after village expecting provisions. Instead, they found silence. Entire communities had disappeared. The campaign was beginning to change. Although the army remained enormous, signs of strain were appearing everywhere. Soldiers marched longer distances, horses died from exhaustion, supply wagons fell behind. Food became harder to find. Food became harder to find. Yet Napoleon remained confident. He believed that one major battle would solve everything. Eventually, the Russians would have to stand and fight. And when they did, he would defeat them. Finally, in September 1812, the opportunity arrived. Near the village of Borodino, the Russian army turned to face him. The Battle of Borodino became one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Thousands of cannons thundered across the battlefield. Infantry charged through smoke and fire. Cavalry attacks shook the ground. For hours, both sides fought with extraordinary determination. When the battle ended, Napoleon held the field. Technically, he had won, but it was not the victory he needed. The Russian army had not been destroyed. Instead, it retreated once again, and once again, Napoleon followed. A few days later, he reached his greatest prize, Moscow, the ancient capital of Russia. Many expected the campaign to end there. Napoleon certainly did. He believed that capturing Moscow would force Russia to negotiate. After all, what nation could continue fighting after losing one of its most important cities? But when French forces entered Moscow, they encountered something unexpected. The city was nearly empty. Most of the population had left. The victory felt strangely hollow. And then, things became even worse. Within days, fires began spreading across Moscow. At first, they seemed isolated. Then they multiplied. Soon, entire districts were burning. Strong winds carried flames from building to building. The city became an inferno. Napoleon watched as Moscow burned around him. The prize he had marched hundreds of miles to capture was being destroyed before his eyes. And still, no peace offer came from Russia. Instead of ending the war, Moscow marked the beginning of disaster. The destruction of Moscow left Napoleon with a difficult choice. Winter was approaching. Supplies were running low. The Russian army remained intact, yet he still hoped that Tsar Alexander would agree to negotiate. Days passed, then weeks. No offer came. The Russians refused to surrender. They refused to negotiate. And with every passing day, the situation became more dangerous. The first snow began to fall. At first, it seemed harmless. Many soldiers welcomed the cooler temperatures after months of marching, but the weather continued to worsen. Cold winds swept across the Russian plains. Roads became difficult to travel. Food became even harder to find. Napoleon finally realized that remaining in Moscow was impossible. The Grand Army would have to retreat. In October 1812, the long journey home began. The army that marched out of Moscow was no longer the confident force that had entered Russia months earlier. Thousands had already been lost. Supplies were critically low, and winter was only beginning. As the French retreated, the temperature continued to fall. Snow covered roads and fields. Rivers began to freeze. Strong winds cut through uniforms that had never been designed for such extreme conditions. The Russian army followed at a distance. They did not need to launch massive attacks. The weather was already doing much of the work for them. Every day, more soldiers disappeared from the ranks. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others could no longer endure the cold. Horses died in huge numbers. Without horses, wagons could not move. Without wagons, supplies could not reach the men who needed them. The retreat became a nightmare. What had once been one of the most powerful armies in Europe was slowly falling apart, and the worst was still to come. The secret weapon that would crush Napoleon was finally revealing itself. It was not a cannon. It was not a rifle. It was not a new military invention. It was the combination of distance, logistics, starvation, and the brutal Russian winter. These forces worked together relentlessly. Unlike an enemy army, they could not be defeated in battle. And unlike a fortress, they could not be captured. They simply continued their work day after day, destroying the Grande Armée piece by piece. The campaign that began with confidence and ambition was becoming one of the greatest military disasters in history. The disaster reached its peak during the retreat from Russia. As winter tightened its grip on the land, the Grande Armée struggled simply to survive. Food had become scarce. Many soldiers had not eaten properly for days. Some searched abandoned villages, hoping to find supplies. Others survived on whatever they could carry. The cold became relentless. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snowstorms reduced visibility. Marching became slower and more exhausting with every passing day. The once proud army was now spread across vast distances. Units became separated. Discipline weakened. Confusion grew. Meanwhile, Russian forces continued to pressure the retreating French. Cossack cavalry appeared suddenly from forests and snow-covered hills. They attacked isolated groups, captured supplies, and disappeared before a major response could be organized. The retreat was no longer a military operation. It was a struggle for survival. One of the most dangerous moments came at the Berezina River. As Napoleon's army approached the river, Russian forces moved to trap them. Panic spread through the ranks. Thousands of soldiers, civilians, horses, and wagons crowded the riverbanks. If the crossing failed, the army could be destroyed completely. French engineers worked under extraordinary pressure. Despite freezing conditions and enemy attacks, they constructed temporary bridges across the icy water. The crossing became chaotic. Men rushed forward, wagons jammed the narrow bridges, artillery fire echoed across the battlefield. Many never made it across. Yet somehow, a large portion of the surviving army escaped. The crossing of the Berezina became one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire campaign. But even after escaping, the suffering continued. The retreat stretched on through snow, ice, hunger, and exhaustion. Every mile claimed more lives. By the time the survivors finally left Russian territory, the scale of the disaster had become impossible to ignore. The army that had entered Russia with hundreds of thousands of men had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Napoleon had escaped, but the Grande Armée had been shattered. The consequences would be felt across Europe.
News of the Russian disaster spread rapidly across Europe. For years, Napoleon had appeared unstoppable. Now, for the first time, his enemies saw weakness. The destruction of the Grande Armée changed everything. Nations that had once feared France began preparing for war. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and other powers saw an opportunity. If Napoleon could be defeated in Russia, perhaps he could be defeated elsewhere as well. Across Europe, new armies were assembled. Old alliances were restored. Military leaders began planning campaigns that would challenge French dominance. The Russian campaign had not simply destroyed an army, it had transformed the balance of power in Europe. Napoleon understood the danger. Despite the catastrophe, he moved quickly to rebuild his forces. New soldiers were recruited. New units were organized. And once again, Europe prepared for war. But replacing men was easier than replacing experience. Many of the veterans lost in Russia could never be replaced. The Grande Armée that had once dominated Europe was gone. The years that followed would bring more battles, more victories, and more defeats. Eventually, Napoleon would be forced from power. Although many events contributed to his downfall, the invasion of Russia marked a turning point. It was the moment when the momentum of his empire began to reverse. The campaign remains one of history's most important military lessons. It demonstrated that even the greatest commanders have limits. It showed that logistics can be just as important as battlefield victories, and it proved that nature itself can become a powerful weapon. In the end, the secret weapon that crushed Napoleon was not a single thing. It was distance, it was supply, it was weather, it was time. Together, they accomplished what Europe's armies could not. They broke the most powerful military force of its age, and they changed the course of history forever.